On the future trade deal between the UK and the EU, French President Emmanuel Macron is pushing Brussels to adopt a hard-line stance. Even before the negotiations started, the French government made clear to the EU's chief negotiator Michel Barnier that he had to push for stronger commitments on regulatory alignments and access to UK fishing waters in return for maintaining free trade. Mr. Macron said he was willing to put up a fight over the issue back in February, but so is Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Britons are not likely to forgive the former Mayor of London any concessions on the matter. The Common Fisheries Policy (CFP) was a central part in the Brexit campaign, and the majority of British fishermen and people living in coastal towns pushed for Britain to leave the bloc. British fishermen believe UK waters are not only overfished by other EU countries but that the CFP also means they are restricted as to how much they can fish. In a report for the Brexit think tank Red Cell titled, Putting the Fisheries Negotiations into Context, and published in March, the leader of Save Britain's Fish John Ashworth brilliantly explained the 4 things the EU did that completely crushed UK fishing. He wrote, "We cannot continue with a system that has failed for 40 years. What crushed British fishing is fourfold. The surrender, mismanagement, corporatization and penetration of national resources in what many in the fishing industry believe was a slow series of contrived steps. The EU established equal access to what became common EU waters, resources at the inception of the CFP in the knowledge that Britain, with rich fisheries, would join. The prominent Brexiteer noted, this is what Ted Heath sold out to. Despite being made well aware of the consequences, the famous response was British fishermen and coastal communities were expendable. Equal access allowed the EU to claim after 10 years things were going a bit sideways with stocks. A marauding EU fleet combined with technical advances Britain couldn't curb with her own policy had denuded stocks. This led to the introduction of an EU system of quotas. Conveniently, the EU fleets declared a huge track record of fish landed. This resulted in them on average having 75% of the quotas under a system of relative stability shares between member states, yet Britain provides 50% of the waters and 60% of the catches in EU waters of the Northeast Atlantic. Therefore, initially, Mr. Ashworth wrote, due to this surrender and carve-up, the EU made off with half the resources that should have been British had Britain been like Norway with independent fisheries. Thereafter, to divide out the small quota share Britain did receive, the government initiated a system called FQA units. Mr. Ashworth explained, these FQA units entitle those who hold them to a particular proportion of the quota pie regardless of the annual tonnage that year. This corporatized a national resource as the government allowed these FQA units to become tradable. As the quota system doesn't work in a mixed fishery, and as our waters were overexploited by a herd of EU boats, we were subject to ever harsher quota cuts based on dodgy data the quotas generated. This paucity of data is caused because fishermen can't land everything they catch, only those species they have quota for. Anything over quota is dumped dead into the sea. Fishermen have to therefore catch twice the fish to find what they can keep. Critically, science is left with an erroneous picture of actual stock levels. This, combined with the initial loss of our resources when quotas were introduced, pushed a lot of smaller family concerns to the wall as the industry consolidated to last man standing, those with the bigger checkbooks who could buy ever more FQA units that were needed just to maintain the parity of the same tonnage of fish to catch to pay loans. Mr. Ashworth claimed this allowed EU operations, which were traditionally big, to set up in Britain and muscle out British family fishing struggling under EU rules. Margaret Thatcher tried to stop these EU flagships, but were overruled by the European Court of Justice (ECJ) in the Factortame case. Mr. Ashworth asked, was all of the above a series of incidental coincidences or something deliberately planned to allow the transfer of all Britain's resources into EU hands with only a few big compliant British operators who felt, we're all right, Chuck?